The city looks almost unrecognisable in old photos and video. Not exactly that surprising, considering the passage of time, but it's easy to swoon over what's been lost. While I don't agree that something should be saved just because it's old, many fantastic buildings have been lost over the decades. These were usually replaced in the 1960s with what were effectively glass cubes. This video is not about what we've lost, however, that can be another video. Today, we'll be exploring the CBD and discovering what survived, and ultimately, what is the very oldest. I need to set some constraints, however, otherwise I'll be rattling off buildings all day. I'm sticking to buildings within the 6000 postcode, the south of the railway, and east of the freeway. I think we can all safely agree that's the CBD, more or less. I couldn't find an official map showing where exactly it starts and ends. Additionally, I'll only be considering buildings built before the 1880s. This list would just be too long otherwise. Maybe I'll cover different periods of surviving buildings in different videos. They also need to be somewhat intact of their original construction. Some locations have been altered significantly over the decades, not resembling their former selves in the slightest. Some examples include St Mary's Cathedral, the Archbishop's Palace, and the old central government offices. While construction of those did start in my chosen timeline, they've all been built on and changed substantially over the decades. For example, St Mary's wasn't formally finished until 2009. But if they've just been modernised or had modifications, that's fine. These buildings are extremely old after all, I think that's understandable. With the ground rules out of the way, let's start by taking a trip to the 70s. The 1870s, that is. We will then work our way down through the decades and discover Perth CBD's oldest building. First off, the Convent of Mercy, built in 1871. This can be found on the corner of Goderich Street and Victoria Square. The Sisters of Mercy arrived in Perth in 1846, having travelled from Ireland. They created the first woman-run school in Australia. This catered to the poor, Aboriginals and orphaned Irish girls. It was built using bricks from the East Perth Brickworks, which is now the Queen's Gardens. It was known as the Mother House to the Order, and remained as the primary house for the Sisters of Mercy until 2011. I don't know much more to be honest, but it is referred to as the Mercy Heritage Centre in some sources, although it appears to no longer serve that function. I'm not entirely sure what it's used for now. It is a part of Mercedes College, however, which we'll see more of later in the video. Next, a landmark I'm sure you're all familiar with, Wesley Church. This is found on the corner of William and Hay Streets and was built in 1870. These days it's a uniting church, but was founded by the Methodists. The land was purchased for £400 and architect duties were assigned to Richard Roach Jewell. He will appear several times in this video, but he was a member of this church, so I'd assume it was an important project for him. The foundation stone was laid October 1867 and the church opened April 1870 at a cost of £3,000. It was built in the Gothic Revival style and is a striking building to be situated right in the heart of the CBD. Originally, there was a bell in the steeple from a ship called the Tranby, which original members of the congregation travelled to Perth on. The 1880s also saw additional works to the church. An organ was installed in 1880, with side galleries, a porch, and the north-east tower constructed in 1896. The new tower was built over the foundation stone, just in case you happen to go looking for it. The Meckering earthquake, the subject of my previous video, caused structural damage to the church. It was thought the steeple would be demolished entirely, but they ultimately only removed 9 metres worth and added a metal cone. One source states that the bell was then put on display outside, along Hay Street. Another source claims it has actually resided at Wesley College since its inception in the 1920s. Either way, we can be sure that's where it resides in the modern day. One city block to the east, on the corner of Hay and Barrack Street, you will find the Perth Town Hall. Constructed between 1868 and 1870, Richard Roach Jewell again pops up as the designer in partnership with James Manning. It was the tallest building in Perth when it was built, and has the distinction of being the only town hall in Australia built by convicts and in the Gothic style. The clock was important, as most people didn't have personal timekeeping devices during this time. There are bells for the clock too, which have been used for a variety of reasons besides from chiming the time. They have been rung to signal emergencies like a fire, but the ABC also used them in the 1930s for their time signals. The hall is modelled on European 14th century market towns. As such, the Undercroft was originally used as a food market. Later, it was enclosed, with the space becoming a fire station. By the mid-1920s, the area was occupied by storefronts which stuck around into the late 1990s. The undercroft then went through a major restoration and is now similar to how it originally looked. It's one of the few locations on this list you can freely explore. Usually, it's open between 10 AM to 4 PM, Monday to Saturday. Although on my 2 separate visits, the upstairs was sectioned off because someone was getting married. There was a pretty cool Japanese art exhibition downstairs, however. The last time I was in the hall itself was during the 2017 Perth Games Festival. I was covering it as a correspondent for GameCloud at the time. So, shout out to GameCloud. Rest in peace. Located on St George's Terrace, in between Council House and the Perth Concert Hall, you'll find Government House. Built mostly by convicts from 1859 to 1864, this elegant Victorian Tudor mansion was designed by Edmund Henderson. It includes 41 rooms and is surrounded by 3 hectares of English gardens. It was built right next to the original Government House, which dates back to 1834, but that was demolished in the 1880s. The ballroom on the western side, however, was built in the 1890s. Quick, here's a chance to post some cringy photos from my Year 12 ball. It seemed a bit fancy for my school. Additional rooms were added to Government House in the late 19th century. This included a billiards room, a supper room, and a dining room. In the early 1900s, the lodge was built near the gated entrance. This was originally used to house the governor's police orderly, but has been in office since the 1980s. The garden has been open to the public since the 1960s and retains its layout from the 1850s. It's full of big old trees, usually planted by notable members of society, including the monarchy. Interestingly, the lake in the southeastern corner represents the original shoreline of the Swan River before land reclamation. Additionally, what's referred to as the ravine in front of Government House was originally a creek. This provided water for the gardens as it ran into the river. It must have been a deep creek. It's well worth a visit, but access is a bit tight. It's the only place I thought I might get into trouble for filming. It is still the official residence for the governor after all. There are several open days per year for the building itself, but your best bet is from 12 to 2 PM, Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays. The house is sectioned off, but you can freely roam the magnificent gardens. When you think about Trinity Church, you probably think about what you can see from St George's Terrace. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but that frontage opened in 1894 beyond the self-imposed rules of this video. What you might not know is that Trinity Church is comprised of 3 different structures that have joined together as they were built. The oldest, now in the middle and known as Trinity Hall, was constructed in 1864. Richard Roach Jewell reappeared as the architect. This was the primary chapel until the St George's Terrace structure was built, but an additional schoolroom was built behind Trinity Hall in 1872. Jewell was again the architect. I've walked through there many times, but never noticed how the distinct structures join together. Reminds me of a certain film from 2009, which probably isn't appropriate to reference. While the 1890s structure is an active uniting church, the schoolhouse is a lunchroom with incredibly reasonable prices for the modern economy, with the original 1860s chapel now a school for seniors. It's all of course now part of Trinity Arcade, which is a great piece of preserved architecture in its own right. Hidden away between lush gardens and skyscrapers, on the corner of Mounts Bay Road and Spring Street, is the Bishop's House. As per inherit, this is the only Victorian Georgian-style residence left in the CBD. It was built by ticket of leave men in 1859 for the first Anglican Bishop of Perth, Matthew Hale. The land was partially chosen because there was a spring that ran during all seasons, hence the street name. The land already included a house and stables. The existing house was turned into a kitchen, while the stables were converted to laundry and kitchen outhouses. Several other buildings were constructed on the site which are now long gone, including a 2-storey building used as a school for Aboriginals. There was also an additional cottage built for visiting clergymen. Bishop's House was considered a cultural centre in Perth at the time, with Hale hosting clubs for book reading, dramatics and debating. Bishops continued to live in the house after Hale moved to Brisbane in 1875. The house was enlarged in 1904 by the bishop of the time, Charles Owen Lever Riley. I'm not entirely sure by how much, however. His successor, Henry Frewen Lee Fanyu, lived in the house until his death in 1946. He would be the last bishop to reside there. From 1959, it was leased to Legacy Australia and became their Perth headquarters. They are a non-profit who support families of servicemen who've been casualties of war. In the following decades, it was leased to Anglicare and the Perth Diocesan Trust. That was owned by an English entrepreneur named Lord Alistair McAlpine, who used the building as his home and office. It was then sold to Multiplex and the Hawaiian Property Group in 1999, who built the surrounding skyscrapers you can see today. The Bishop's house itself is now a restaurant called Lamont's, which I probably couldn't afford. At the very least, the surrounding restored gardens are open to the public for free. I feel like this is a bit of a hidden gem. The big wall around the garden isn't that inviting, and the sign saying you can come in is quite small. While exploring the connecting St George's Square and Forest Centre, I came across this. It's called the Forest House. It's difficult to find information about it, but a plaque says it's a replica. It was built after the original building was demolished in 1981. It was built in the 1870s and was the home of Alexander Forrest, brother of John Forrest. Like John, he was a surveyor, explorer, and politician. The building is vacant currently, but appeared to once be the Forest Centre Tavern. I have no idea when that closed, but this Flickr photo from 2014 shows it as Rigsby's Bar and Bistro. According to the caption, the developers were forced to rebuild this replica after bulldozing the original. Let's head back to the other side of the city. On the corner of St George's Terrace and Pier Street, you'll find the Deanery. This was built in 1859 for Perth's first dean, Reverend George Purvis Pownall. It's one of the few intact residences from this period in the entire state. It was constructed by ticket of leave convicts and designed by, you guessed it, Richard Roach Jewell. It continued to be a residence for deans, and there were renovations in the 1910s and 1930s to keep up modern living standards. It continued as this function until 1953, when demolition was proposed. The church wished to replace it with a 10-storey high office block. Thankfully, there was a public outcry and it was saved. It was renovated again and continued as a residence for assistant priests, caretakers, and the dean's secretary. There was then an extensive restoration in 1979, which included the surrounding garden. $95,000 was raised, with nearly $70,000 coming from the National Trust. It reopened as offices in 1982 and has maintained that purpose ever since. The land it sits on has a dark history, however, originally occupied by the Perth Jail. It's theorised that the town stocks stood there too. Yagan's father, Midgegooroo, was executed here by firing squad in 1833. The story that led up to that event is a long one and beyond the scope of this video, but it's definitely a story worth knowing. I'll link some reading materials in the description, but in summary, he was a respected elder who opposed colonisation and was accused of several murders. However, the execution was carried out with no trial or other due process. As far as I'm concerned, the Cloisters are easily the coolest looking building in this video. It's like a miniature Tudor castle, but located on St George's Terrace, perpendicular to the Mill Street intersection. It was built by convicts in 1858, and I probably don't even need to say who the architect was at this point. It was built by Bishop Hale, whose house we visited earlier in the video. The Cloisters are significant for being the first purpose-built secondary school in Western Australia. Back then, it was called the Perth Church of England Collegiate School. By all accounts, it was a rich boys' school. It was attended by notable students from the Forest, Roe and Wittenoom families. It eventually then became a girls' school in 1872. The building was extended to the west between 1879 and 1880, adding further classrooms and dormitories, but it closed as a school in the 1890s. The internals were then split into two portions and rented out as private residences. One of those tenants planted a Port Jackson fig tree in 1887, which has luckily survived development around it. By the 1910s, one side was a boarding house, while the other was a theological college. The whole building then became a hostel for the newly formed UWA in 1918. It suffered a fire in 1931, but was restored at a cost of £2,000. It then served as a guest house until the mid-1960s, when there were plans for demolition. Thankfully, there was a campaign to save the structure. Developers negotiated to retain and restore the building in exchange for a higher plot ratio for the development behind. That became Cloisters Square. The original Cloisters became a commercial building from 1971, with the existing interior gutted, and it's stayed that way ever since. On my visit, it was occupied by a men's tailor, a showroom selling office furniture, and a company that builds change rooms. The Perth Boys' School was established in 1847, but did not have its own building. It instead occupied various buildings around Perth, including the old Courthouse, which we'll talk about soon. Eventually, they needed their own building. Believe it or not, this site was originally a water-powered flour mill. This was the first mill in Perth and was operated by the civil engineer for the colony, Henry Reveley, who has popped up several times before on this channel. This building was designed by William Ashford Sanford, the colonial secretary at the time. His brother Henry was a prominent character in my recent video about the Linton Convict Depot. Construction began in 1853 and it opened a year later. It was built by sandstone ferried up the river by convicts. It It was criticised for not having enough natural light and poor ventilation, however, so there were a few additions throughout the 1860s. The building received a gallery in 1860, which has since been demolished, a southern wing in 1865, and the northern wing in 1868. There were usually about 200 students, but ballooned up to nearly 350 during the gold rush. Temporary wooden buildings were constructed for more space until the school was moved to a new location on James Street. That's now Picker, a favourite place of mine to visit for a drink after researching in the State Archives next door. This building then became the western wing of the Perth Technical College in the early 1900s. The Perth Technical College was the beginnings of Curtin University, which began in the 1960s. I'm not entirely sure when they stopped occupying the premise, but it became the WA headquarters for the National Trust in 1977. It then became a storefront for them in the early 1990s, and then a cafe in 1995. At some point, it became a wine bar too, complete with pamphlets about heritage trails. Here's a blurry photo I found from 2008. I would have loved to have a glass of wine there. Since 2015, it's been leased by Curtin University, who use it for a range of purposes. It appears to be an art gallery these days, but wasn't open on my visit. Let's now head back to Victoria Square. St John's Pro Cathedral is both the first and the oldest Roman Catholic church in Western Australia. It was used until 1865, when it became too small for the growing congregation, despite being enlarged in 1855. This triggered the construction of the nearby St Mary's Cathedral. A veranda on the north side was then constructed by the Sisters of Mercy, with the building becoming the start of their school, which is now Mercedes College. It's then served as the Convent's chapel until 1924, where it was reverted back to classroom use. In the late 70s, the building was restored to its original form, with the school additions removed. The portico, originally built in 1856, was removed in 1881, but was rebuilt during the restoration. It was then used as a museum for the Catholic Church. These days, it's again used as a house of worship. Researching the church led me to the Holy Cross Convent, situated right behind it. If my research is correct, this unassuming building dates back to 1848. It was the site of the first Sisters of Mercy convent in Australia. After a new convent was built in 1877, the very first building mentioned in this video, this became an orphanage for girls. This building is now just called the Holy Cross. Sometime over the decades, it was built onto in an easterly direction. These days, it's the Visual Arts Centre of Mercedes College. Also, side note, what is this tomb that appears on the old sewer maps? Is there really a tomb in the middle of the school? It's good to see the drafter was accurate at least. It is now time for the oldest building in the CBD, which is, drumroll, the old Courthouse. It was designed by Henry Reveley, who you may remember from my Burswood Island video. This is one of two of his structures that still remain, the other being the roundhouse in Fremantle. It was built in 1836 and at the time was situated on the banks of the Swan River. These days, it's over 200 metres from the shoreline because of land reclamation. Besides from a courthouse, it had a range of other uses. This was the very early days of the colony after all, and such a building was uncommon. Like mentioned before, it was used as a school, but also a church, an immigration depot, and for other public events like concerts and meetings. It was still used for its original intended purpose until 1879, when it was then used as a government store until 1895. It then reverted back to a court, but instead used as a reserve venue. Lastly, it operated as an arbitration court until 1965. After that, it was in the care of the Law Society of WA, and beginning in 1987, it opened as a museum. They restored the building to how it would have looked in 1905. Entry is free, but if you give a donation, you get a fridge magnet. It's a great museum that details the court process in the early years of the colony, usually highlighting how harsh it was. It's amazing how much info and exhibits they've crammed in, considering how small the building is. Do yourself a favour and check it out. Lastly, I have a few special mentions since I know someone will ask about them if I don't. Firstly, there's St George's Hall, which was built in 1879. This is notable as Perth's first dedicated theatre building. Sadly, it was demolished in the 1980s, but they at least left the facade and the portico standing. This can be found on Hay Street in front of the District Court of Western Australia. And of course, we can't forget about the Pensioners Barracks built in 1863, which is now just an archway thanks to the freeway. I was going to summarise it here, but it's currently covered in scaffolding for restoration works. But fear not, as this is worthy of its own video. I'm just waiting for one of the open days so I can film inside. Well, unless someone from the city of Perth wants to let me in. I'm flexible and will pay you with a pint. Speaking of pints, it's time for the outro. After 14,000 steps trotting around town to film this video, I was ready for some lunch. I chose the Royal Hotel as I think it's the oldest existing CBD pub you can still drink in. It's just out of my criteria, being built in 1882, but I wanted a drink and couldn't find anything older. It was designed by Henry Trigg, the very first Western Australian born and trained architect. It was originally known as the Shrews Royal Hotel, with a lot of the current facade appearing in a 1906 renovation thanks to Gold Rush money. It was then owned by the Swan Brewery from 1925. Kind of funny really, since they only had Swan Gold on tap during our lunch. We settled for Melbourne Bitter. Either way, I'm not sure how long they owned it or who ran it later, but the official website for Western Australia states it's the longest running hotel in the city. Before its current incarnation, I always just assumed it was just a hotel. But if you look at the 2007 and 2009 Street View captures from Wellington Street, the sign claims it won the Best Pub Hotel Accommodation Award in 2005. I was in primary school in 2005, so I never drank in there personally, but if you did, please let me know. Regardless, it was significantly renovated in 2019 to what we can see today. This included reinstating the balconies, which are perfect for people watching. Anyway, cheers! If you'd like to support the channel, I offer bonus behind the scenes videos. In the most recent, I visited Meckering on a very short filming trip using my new whiz-bang Subaru Forester car camping setup. I vlogged the trip while we also camped in a ghost town. This, along with a vlog that involves the construction process and camping amongst other abandoned history, can be viewed for a membership subscription. Other videos include 2 longer filming trip vlogs. One was based around Kew, while another was in the surrounds of Kalgoorlie. I've also released a behind the scenes vlog on how I made the Claysbrook video, several vlogs where I take you along on reconnaissance missions, and a travel guide to Melbourne. In that, I take you to several Victorian locations that you might find interesting. The support program is just $3 a month and can be cancelled at any time. That $3 includes the extra content, shows your username at the end of the videos, and highlights any comments you might make. All money earned goes back into the production of future videos. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.